Welcome to the Global Citizen Life podcast. Today on the show, we have Matthew Bliss. He's an Australian teacher, trainer, L&D developer, and podcasting expert with a strong background in technology and digital working. The last decade of his career has been broad, covering IT support, teaching, facilitation, learning development and delivery, and all across education and government in Australia. Living in Melbourne during the pandemic, he assisted his colleagues to move quickly to remote work and has since been a strong advocate for productivity with technology, but not at the expense of staff well-being. With a new opportunity in content development, Matthew now creates audio and video podcasts for himself and others. He is starting at the entrepreneurial venture into providing his digital work and technology experience to individuals and businesses across the world. New to expat life, he and his wife have moved to Ireland from Australia to live in their home country for a time and to see if it's a good fit. Well, welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thank you, Sally. Thanks for having me on.
And so you are now in Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
How long have you been there, and why did you choose Ireland from Australia, moving from Australia?
Well, the choice was easy. I got together with my wife maybe 10 to 12 years ago, and she's Irish, and we met in Australia. So eventually it was going to be on the cards that we would give it a go moving over here. Actually, a few months after we got together, we lived in London for a time, just because my wife couldn't get a visa in Australia at the time. She started with the working holiday visa. That ran out, had to rely on sponsorships. And then after that, it just kind of didn't renew. So we gave London a shot. Didn't quite work out for us. Went back on the partnership to Australia for a little while. And funnily enough, we resolved to come to Ireland in 2020. But little did we know that the planet would change. So we had a lot of time to think about it and what we'd do and get some planning in place. A lot of the planning happened 6 months before we left, which was in June of this year, at the time of recording, 2023. And so we've been here for, give or take, 3 or 4 months. And it's going well so far.
Good. So is it a big change from living in Australia? Because I'm sure like you had your family there and now you're with her family in Ireland. So that's some changes there, but I'm assuming kind of day-to-day life is pretty similar between Ireland and Australia.
You'd think so. I think on the face of it, if you looked at it on paper, it would be pretty much the same. But there are some major differences. One of those big ones, that bio that you read is so diverse and broad, mostly because at the time that I delivered that to you, I was still trying to figure out exactly what my job would be here, because Australia is a little bit more technology forward in a lot of different areas, and Ireland's not behind. It's just at a different stage of development in different areas. And what that means for general life over here is that for some people, it's not as technology forward as you'd expect. In terms of the seasons, that's probably a radical change that I enjoy, because if I get to miss out on another Australian summer where a week is like 45, 50 degrees Celsius, which would be like 110 Fahrenheit for you, I think.
Too hot.
Not the best. I mean, I think it's Las Vegas and those kinds of areas in Arizona that probably cop the hottest temperatures for you guys. So yeah, in Australia, it happened way too often. So I'd very happily trade out a few days at below zero as opposed to above 40 degrees. But other than that, us settling in, like we've tried to make life as simple as possible for ourselves. We're living in a town as opposed to in the countryside or the outskirts or a village too far removed from the creature comforts that we would have enjoyed in Australia. So we tried to get as close as we can, but it's hard to cover all the small differences in a single conversation, but there are differences.
What about kind of the overall cost of living? because we do
Yeah.
hear quite a bit, or I hear quite a bit. Dublin specifically is very expensive. But I have also heard Australia as a whole, even though I'm now comparing a city to a country, I know, but that Australia is quite expensive as well. So
Mm.
how do you see the comparison for cost of living?
Uh, for us, it was largely on balance for the most part, but I think we've been very
Okay.
fortunate with where
Hmm.
we chose to live in the west of Ireland as opposed to around Dublin.
Hmm.
Uh, Also, the cost barriers are kind of that they balance the scales a little bit. So where in Australia you might pay quite a large amount for your groceries, depending on what you purchase, of course. Uh, in Ireland, the same grocery haul might be, half the price or 70% of the price that you'd pay over there. Um, and look, we won't talk real estate in huge detail because I think the entire planet is suffering from that. But Ireland has
It's
a very,
absurd. It is absolutely absurd. And I just
it is,
don't, it's unsustainable. It's gonna have to give eventually. Like it's just not sustainable, I believe
yeah,
anyway. But and the problem with real estate though too is because people ask me often too, like, well, how much does a house cost? And it's like, well, if you're in Canada, I'm going to ask you how much does a house cost? You're going to say, well, where are you? How big, city, location? Like it varies so dramatically. Like it's just
yeah.
not a question that can just easily be answered.
No, and those post economic impacts of COVID, I think, are the biggest factors for those. Like in Canada,
Mhm,
I know I was reading a
mhm.
lot about how companies were buying up properties to create massive rental parks where they can control the rental economy in that area and push people out if they don't want them. In
Mhm.
Australia, it was unfortunately very similar, but from a government level, where for a short time, because of for listeners who aren't aware, Melbourne, where I was living, is it was one of the most locked down cities in the world. I
Wow.
think in total it had. I could be wrong. It's been that long since that I've forgotten, and
Mhm.
who would want to remember?
We don't
But
want to remember that stuff. We want to remember a little bit, but we don't really want to remember the detail. We want to remember so it doesn't
precisely,
happen again. But other than that, we want to forget.
that's it. But I think it was like 175 to 200 days total. We
Wow.
had maybe 6 or 7 bouts of lockdowns over the course of 2 years, which was warranted. I mean, everybody was trying to figure it out. But what that meant for house pricing at the time had a slow ongoing impact. And the government tried to offset that in a very silly way by allowing people to dip into their pensions to cover house deposits in uh, a controlled market, which then inflated and forced people to lose because they couldn't cover their mortgages, which
Right.
was really unfortunate in Australia. And look, it's still pervading now. Trying to find rentals in Australia, at least, is easy enough as long as you have the money to pay. But this is where Ireland has something a little bit different. Dublin, as you mentioned, is incredibly expensive. It's almost like, unless you have a high paying job there, you cannot live there.
Right.
And most people, even in Ireland, during COVID, moved to the outer areas, like maybe 2 hour drive, and they would commute into Dublin as needed. Lockdowns persisting and internet being pervasive, luckily, meant that they didn't have to travel at all. So the country lifestyle was good.
Right.
But the availability of properties across Ireland is really the thing, the scarcity. So even if you have the cash to drop, if you can't find a
Understandable.
place, you're just going to get stuck. So I think over the course of the month and a half that we were looking in the city that we live in, we maybe saw 4 properties. And all of those were through one agent, which was the only one that kind of, was open to our custom to try and find a place that would come across their desk. And this wasn't advertised properties either. It was we know people who are looking, so we're going to connect them with these properties, as opposed to putting it on sites and, general market expectations you'd have in other countries. And that's just the
Right.
way things are here. So here it's scarcity more so than cost. But as you say, Dublin is its own economy at this stage. All the jobs are there, all the properties are there, but for that reason, it's all just inflated to the point where it's almost unsustainable.
Yeah, I was there, well, obviously before the pandemic, so several years ago now, and talking with people there, and they said basically when a big turning point for Dublin and the cost of living was when Google moved in. When Google
Mm,
moved their headquarters. So it was when they talk about Dublin, they say, well, before Google or after Google? Because before
yeah.
it was very different. And then when it moved in, it brought some good things with it. You know, there was jobs and there were good things, but then also the prices of housing has just gone
Yeah.
crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So
Mm.
you know, there's always pros and cons with everything.
Yeah, but the one thing about Ireland is the government is great for creating incentives for people. It's something that maybe we'll talk about a bit later on for the individual as opposed to companies. But for the longest time, it had a very attractive tax incentive for companies looking to house their companies here. So Google, Apple, Microsoft, Cisco, tons of them placed here. I
Yes.
think I
Well,
think LinkedIn's official address is still Ireland, even
is
though
it?
the tax rate has matched Europe and as
Okay.
the
But
general
then, but with the
rating.
matching rate for them, that's not worth them moving. They want a better
That's the
rate
thing.
to
Doesn't
move.
justify the
And
moving cost. Yeah.
exactly. And I mean, it makes sense. And I talk to business owners sometimes about this too. It's, you know, just because you live in a country doesn't mean you have to have your corporation registered there. And when we look at these big companies, they move for tax benefits. And if you yourself, if you've got a company and you're paying 30% tax, well, if you just move your headquarters and you reduce your taxes, you don't necessarily have to live in that country. Now, some countries you do, so it's not just that black and white, but it makes sense as a business perspective to save 15, 20, 25% in taxes. That could be a potential of a lot of money. Or for even a small company, that makes a big difference when you can reinvest that back into your company, or have it for, you know, to pay yourself more, but then you're paying more personal tax. But even
Mm,
still, it makes a big difference. And that's why big corporations move to other countries.
yeah. But the funny thing is, for the individual, it's actually very unattractive in Ireland in terms of the tax rate. Their
Mhm.
their tax rates are probably at the top end in the range of like 53% of your income, which is crazy. And it's not a system that's tiered like Australia's one is that I'm used to, where you have thresholds of income and you only
Mhm.
get charged higher rates of tax on whatever is beyond that threshold. In Ireland, there's two. It's 20% and 40%. And then there's considerations for spousal tax returns and pensions and government contributions that haven't been removed after the need went away. Yeah, tax is a
Mhm.
complex conversation that not just
A-
companies, everybody should think about.
Absolutely. It really, I was at a conference I was speaking at a few months ago, and you know, there was many people talking about many wonderful places around Europe and different things. And I said, you know, we can sit here and say if we look at Europe, there's a number of places that have great weather, good food, sunny days, like all these wonderful things that everybody wants. I said, so if you're really unsure, or some of the things we need to think about are things that we don't like, or for instance, taxes. Because even though every country has taxes, every country has numerous taxes, depending upon what you're doing and if you're self-employed or company and all that kind of stuff, those numbers vary from country to country. And that can make a difference between
Mm,
perhaps if somebody's on the fence between countries. Because if we look, for example, say France, Spain, and Portugal, very similar region. You know, of course, there's differences within each. But if people are really torn of, oh, I don't know which one I should go to, it's like, well, which affordability wise, which is better, tax wise, which is in your better interest. And those are things sometimes for people to really consider and think about because it can make a difference.
mm. And it's funny you mentioned Portugal. Recently, that's coming up in conversations for me because, uh, like, as an individual starting a business for myself, um, the whole digital nomad movement has been quite a strong presence for the last few years. Mine would technically be a nomad-ish kind of role, and
Mhm.
getting a taste for the expat lifestyle, I might want to, uh, I guess, take my wife and move somewhere else. take her away from
Right.
her home again. Maybe that won't happen, but we'll see. But they have a flat 10% tax rate for digital nomads in Portugal, which is really interesting. Though you're probably going to tell me the caveats with all that 10%. But
Not the caveats. Actually, they just made an announcement 3-ish days ago that it's called the D7 visa, that they are snating it. It's going to be done. They are no longer going to be taking applications in 2024. So
wow.
now, whether that's January 2024 or December 2024, because we know about the other visas that they were talking about, the golden visa, and then it was debated back and forth if it would stay, would go, everything. But they are also getting rid of that one. But there's still other visas as
Mm,
well. Like there's every country has numerous visas. And so I just say to people, if there's a will, there's a way. If you are set on a certain country and you really want to move there, there's a way to do it. If you are unsure and there's a number of countries, then yes, then you want to look at cost of living, taxes, lifestyle, more things. Because for some people, I've talked to people and they said, you know what, I want to move to Italy. I don't care. And depending upon how much you make, they have a flat tax rate, and so you could be paying less if you make a lot of money. But as some people say, you know what, I don't care if I have to pay taxes compared to what I pay for tax in the US, plus what I pay for healthcare, plus what I pay for my vehicle if I'm in Rome or Florence or places I don't have to have, I'm already paying X amount of dollars and I'm not really getting much in return. But yeah, if I pay that towards taxes, but I'm living in a great place that I love, it's a different lifestyle, I've got healthcare once I'm a resident, and I'm having these things that I could be paying the same, I could be paying a little bit less, but I'm in a place that I love and I enjoy, and that's where I want to be, and I'll gladly pay it. And so
yeah,
it really comes down to personality.
it does. And all of it has to factor in on balance with each other. It can't just be a snap decision for one reason. Like Justin Bieber now lives in Ireland. Okay, I'm going to move there so I can hang out with him, maybe. you know.
I might
But
see him on the street.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, but that was like the primary reason for us moving was that we wanted to give living in my wife's home a try. That
Hmm.
was the primary reason for going back. There is kind of a colloquial call back to Ireland for anyone Irish who lives anywhere else in the world. Some people don't feel it as strongly as others, but many do.
Hmm. Hmm.
And part of it was because a lot of them were ejected in the recession in 2011, I think, and
Hmm.
kind of distributed across the world. And the country has been great at saying, hey, we don't want you here because we can't support you. Go and do your stuff elsewhere. No, okay, we're good now. Come back.
I'm back.
And then come back. We're good now. We're not. Like it's kind of a bit of a whiplash thing. And I think that's
Hmm.
affected a lot of the expats that I see in groups online that talk about it. Some feel the call, come back and have an awful time. Just because, I mean, it's not nationalism, but just the idea that you can be back in your home again, and then you get here and you can't get a job in your career that pays enough for you to have a standard of living you're used to, or you missed your family, spent 2 months with them, and then realized you never wanted to hang out with them again. Unfortunate, but sometimes happens.
That's true though, but that's the truth. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all the things on balance. Money is the big thing that supports whatever you're going to do, and I would urge anyone thinking about it to consider financial stability as the most important thing. But if you're moving to Ireland specifically, uh, the consideration has to be that you will probably take a bit of a salary cut for whatever job you have, which again ties back to the cost of living, which for a
Right.
lot of things that are primary here will be a lot less than in other places. But at the same
Hmm.
time, if you're someone like me who enjoys technology, then you're going to suffer a little bit because it either isn't made in Ireland or is housed here through exports, which makes it exorbitantly expensive compared to the salary that you could potentially make. And it just becomes difficult. So, yeah.
Right. I think you're right. It's that balance of like cost of living, salary with what you want. If you have a simpler life or want a simpler life, want to enjoy nature more, don't need all the gadgets of life and want to enjoy, then it's going to be fantastic for some people. And for others who want to have the newest, latest, and greatest gadget because that's their industry, that's where they thrive, that's where they work, may not be the ideal place for them.
Or connecting in industries that necessarily require you to be around a lot of people in a career that requires those things. Like someone who is working in movies, for example. If you wanted to live in Ireland, you'd either be living in the country and traveling a lot, almost never being home, or you'll live in Dublin and have to make sure you can secure a salary that allows you to get a place that is hopefully up to your living standards, not a share house, potentially, depending on what your circumstances are, in order for you to connect with people that are in the films and movie space. Which in a country like Australia is really interesting. So many films and movies are edited and filmed and created in Australia because those opportunities are made. But because there's so many like disparate capital cities that can be hubs for this kind of thing, and to be honest, we have the space and we're not removing farmland to make that happen. Most of it is useless, or not useless, but largely barren. Means that stuff is a bit more possible. So we'll meet people here who are expats from Australia who I know, like 8 years ago when we were here on holiday, we met someone who was doing the CGI and the graphic effects on the first Thor film, which was really interesting. But the fact that he was out here means that it must have been possible for him to do his thing out here somehow. But he did all of that in Australia. So yeah, I don't know. That was a very far-flung, metaphor for the idea that you could think about this stuff, but it just does.
But I mean, it comes back to when I said earlier, or it could have been in my previous podcast, because I was just talking with somebody just before speaking with you, was when there's a will, there's a way. It may not, and those ways, it may not be cheap. It's probably not going to be simple, and it may not happen fast or quickly. But I believe if somebody really wants to do something, and within reason, of course, relocating, job wise, things like that. When there's a will, if they really want to, they'll find a way somehow to make it work.
Absolutely. And none of this conversation that should deter anyone from coming to Ireland. If you do have the means and you can find a place to live, it's a great place to be. The weather's great. The people are great. Being able to travel halfway across the country in a couple of hours is unreal. Having access to Northern Ireland and the rest of Europe is excellent. It's I'm very happy here, despite, all the things we've talked about so far.
Well, we got those out of the way, because, and I do like to talk about those things when I talk to everybody, because everything isn't, when we watch TV or we look at people's social media platforms, like everything is wonderful and it's all great, but you still have to live, and there's reality, and every country has got things that are kind of negative, or just things that we have to deal with, hoops to jump through, and stuff. There is no perfect country that is just rainbows, butterflies, and unicorns. Like, it just doesn't exist. So with that, so you're there with your wife, so you are on a visa or temporary residency, or how was that working for you to get there?
So this is the fun bit for me. Being married to an Irish citizen entitles me to some very very easy paths to getting a visa. So if you're married to an Irish citizen in Ireland, you're entitled to a stamp 4, which is essentially a stamp you get at customs upon entering the country. Now, the burden of proof there is very small, but you must have your marriage certificate. I believe there is a de facto path as well, though that requires pre-clearance to make happen. On my podcast that I hope I'll get the opportunity to talk about in a sec, we actually talked to an area of the government that created and supported the policy to make de facto partnerships viable in the very same circumstances that I'll be covering here, which is really good. It's important to reflect that. But being married, marriage certificate, all of my wife's passports, because she was an Australian citizen before we left, and my passport, we just say, we want the stamp for visa, go up to the booth together, and they stamp your passport and say, you need to visit a guard or a police station within 90 days, because I believe that's the longest tourist visa that you could get in Ireland. And then you book an appointment in whatever county you're in, have that appointment, they secure some identity documents and, lodge it in the system. And within, a couple of weeks, you have your identity documents and you're registered for that visa, I think for up to 2 years before you have to renew for a third. Now that was relatively simple. There are a lot of things.
Quite simple.
Oh yeah. Like marrying an Irish citizen. It's great.
That's the way to go. Not that we're telling everybody to just do that, but
that is quality advice.
Maybe I need to find myself an Irish husband. So if anybody's listening now.
Well, it's less attractive than it was, if only because the UK Brexited. Otherwise, prior to that, it was the entirety of Europe that you had access to. And when we lived in London, my wife didn't have to do a visa because she had an Irish passport. Pre-Brexit meant that she could work there without limitations or even requiring a visa. She was just a citizen of Europe at that stage. So, but the rest of Europe is still accessible. And after 3 years, 3 or 4 actually, we did some more investigating and it might be 4, but I may have the opportunity to naturalize and get my citizenship. Now, some people might be thinking, well, why is that? That's not hard. Geez, that's quite a long time. In Australia, starting with a partnership visa in 2014, temporary, then moving on to permanent, it took my wife about 9 years to go through all of that visa stuff. And this isn't including the 5 or 6 working sponsorship visas she had and the 1.5 working holiday visa she did before that, to then be eligible to apply for her citizenship. So in a country like Australia, 10 or 11 years. Yeah. So I'm very happy with the way the visa stuff has turned out, and very thankful to my wife that she is in fact Irish when we decided to move here.
Right. Well, it definitely, makes things easier, and it is something for people to consider. I do believe that if you can move to Ireland on different visas, like temporary residency, then to get in after being there, I was just looking at it the other day. After you're there for 8 years, within an 8-year span, you have to be there for a minimum 4 years. So it's one of those things where they say 4 years, but if you go on holidays or you take time away, it deducts that. So it's a certain number of days. Obviously, for being married, those rules are different for you, but for other people, if they wanted to, they got to get the residency, and then over the span of 8 years, they have to be there a minimum 4 years to then apply to get citizenship. So it's a lot of freedom to still travel, because it's only saying that you have to be there for 6 months out of the year with the intention of becoming a citizen and still staying longer. But 6 months out of a year on average it's not a long time, where other countries, and even within Europe, we mentioned Portugal, and I think Portugal, you have to be there 9 months out of every year or something like that to maintain your residency status. I could be a little bit off on that, but it's more than 6 months, that's for sure. And every country has their own rules with residency, how long you have to be there. On occasion, they'll make an exception to the rule if, a family or friend, a family member is very ill or something like that. They may make a few exceptions, but there's still a minimum number of days per year that people have to be in the country while they have their residency.
And there's a little bit of a gray area with in situ applications too. Going through a lot of the expat groups around Ireland specifically, there are a lot that are asking questions like, I could only get my Garda interview, in 8 weeks, but I have to travel for work and leave the country and then come back. So am I allowed to do that? Can me and my husband or my wife go to another country and come back and still be eligible? How do we enter the country on enter on our stamp 4? Or my husband will be out of the country unexpectedly at the time of our Garda appointment. It's our last opportunity. He's taken his passport with him. So how can I confirm his identity without him being there to enable the stamp 4 to happen? A lot of that information isn't really covered very well, probably because they expect, you to do just the standard thing, consecutive time for approval, living in the country that you'll be in. But in all circumstances, it's not always possible.
Right.
And Australia is worse for that. Like, I think for the 4 years out of 8 for Ireland, it might be, I think, a consecutive 6 weeks on some visas that you can't leave the country. And if you do it more than once, you have to talk to immigration in Australia before you leave again, which puts a lot of people out, because obviously it's a very multicultural country.
Mm-hmm.
We've invited refugees. We've invited people from countries that have been quite hostile to its citizens occasionally. And not to mention the pandemic, all of that stuff has meant that Australia has been quite cut off and, deliberately cutting itself off from some countries to make it hard for people to go back and see their families. So, yeah, swings and roundabouts.
Mm-hmm. And those are some things also too to take into consideration for different places for people who are thinking about relocating is for my residency. How long do I have to be there? How easy is it to come and go? You know, there are a lot of things to consider, and it's not just, oh, I'm packing my bags, I'm going to go here, and it's going to be great.
Great for the backpacker, but as soon as you
Great
think
for the,
about tax residency, you have to have rules for yourself based on
that's
the
right.
information you get, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And rules change. So the thing just with that is, just because it's a rule now, as we've seen happening in Portugal over the last year, if you're thinking, okay, I've got it, I'm going to move in 3 years. These are all the rules. These are I know. They may not be the same rules in 3 years.
Yeah. And
Probably for the
keeping up to date is
next
hard.
year, generally. But we've seen things even change quicker than that. So it's something to really kind of consider or think about, and know that just because those rules are the way that they are now, then they may not be the same in 2, 3 years from now.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So finding a way to keep up with that is also extremely important advice for anyone. But luckily there's Facebook
Absolutely.
groups for that kind of thing, where
Mhm.
even if it's not the information itself or someone gets it wrong, you're kind of like, oh yeah, I've been in this country for 2.5 years. Maybe I should have a look at what immigration's been up to and see what's been
Right.
updated. Or there was a change of government, or some new department was created that was designed
Mhm.
to control super genius visas and high paying, whatever. You could make up anything, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. And those things change often. And there's lots of times they're not talked about really until somebody goes through the experience of, oh, well, these are the new rules. It's like, well,
Yeah.
that's wasn't last year when I did this or that. No, oh no, these are new rules now. And they're not, you know, news headlines at all. They're just
Mm,
laws and things that kind of quietly change. And we don't know until we or someone else goes through it. And then
yeah.
that's how we learn.
Sometimes they're not even rules. Again, I'm going to complain about Australia. Great country. You should go see it if you can sit on a plane for 20 hours to get there. But the passport approval process for people applying for citizenship and for visas and stuff like that. Sorry, not passport approval, but visa approval.
Mhm.
It is extended very gradually over time, to the point where 5 or 6 years ago, you'd be looking at 9 months approval time for a visa. That could be blasted way out to 36 months, maybe even 48. And they are like predictive numbers based on the number of applications, but you kind of have to be tactful with that too. Like, we applied
Mhm.
while in London, because applying for a visa outside of Australia tends to get approved much faster than when you're in Australia. And they do that priority because they have a bridging visa, which for any application you have currently in process, is sometimes you're entitled to that bridge, which means you can live, sometimes work in the country without much restriction based on the visa you're going for. So they don't worry about you if you're in there too much. But it could still hamper what you get up to. It could hamper your life a little bit if you've got to wait for 3 years because you met someone while backpacking in the country, and the only way you can stay there is on a partnership visa, but they quote you 36 months, and you're like a CPA trying to get started with accounting, and then you don't have 40,000 to re-educate as a postgraduate international student because you're not on a visa or a resident. Yeah, there's more than just the rules.
Yeah. Do you think that with that they're making it, it's the actual number of people and that's why it's taking longer? Or do you think they're also dragging it out to try to reduce the number of people and not let as many people get residencies, or
we are
maybe a little both?
we are starting to get to a very contentious part of this topic where stories of an Australian Liberal government where the Prime Minister refused access to the country for boats evacuating a war-torn country back in, I want to say 2008, 2010. No longer in government, but also having detention centers where refugees are often sent because they're denied access to the country, still processing what will be their ability to live in the country, but taking a very long time to do so, and often leaving them in conditions that would be inhumane in the best of countries. Also, the idea that we may have like an internal priority access for certain types of citizens, not to mention like anywhere in the world, if you have enough money, you can get anything done quick enough. There's a lot of aspects to this that I probably would go beyond the scope of what your podcast is trying to say, and could potentially put this podcast episode in the bin if we talked about it. So I don't want to go into it too much. But look, don't
want to all of a sudden be blacklisted.
I wouldn't want you to listen back to our awesome conversation about expat life and think, yeah, I'd rather rank well in Australia with my podcast. So I'm just gonna scrap this one.
Yeah, no, it's all good. We'll get back into it. And it's, it just comes down to really it's research, knowing where you're going. Things do change, and finding kind of what's best for you. And so let's talk about some other things that we talk to some people about when they relocate. And what about banking? Like, I'm sure banking Australia compared to Ireland, North America, pretty similar, pretty easy. Or has it been a little bit strange to open up a bank account where there's some hoops to jump through? I mean, easier probably for your wife because she is citizen. And how has it worked for you, or how has that worked?
It is actually not as easy as some countries. I think Australia actually leads a lot of countries in the ability to, excuse me, got a cough. Or it got choked up there. Yeah, I think Australia leads the way with a lot of banking and financial stuff, not in terms of the money itself, but the availability of certain functions, like the chip and pin in Australia on cards came before a lot of other countries, where I think some in the US still operate on signature, potentially. Or are you guys chip and pin now?
Well, I'm Canada, so we're mostly chip and pin or tap. I haven't, but I mean, I left Canada in 2011, so I still go back, but I still have a bank there. I still have an account there, but I don't know for signature. I mean, it must have been, it's been so long, or at least the bank that I deal with, because even in Canada, banks are quite different. Because I was just back a few months ago, And my brother was going to travel. And I said to him, I said, well, he was going to Taiwan. And I said, well, just use your debit card. It's a Visa debit. If it's used anywhere Visa can go. And he said, what are you talking about? I'm like, your debit card, that you use for your bank, and it has Visa on it, and it's your Visa debit. So it's accepted anywhere Visa is. They just take the money right out of your account. It's not a credit card. He said, well, my bank doesn't have that. I said, what are you talking about? Like, my bank's had it for 10, no, gosh, I've been gone for over 10 years. So like 15 years roughly. And he
Mm,
contacted his bank and they're like, oh no, we don't offer that. You can get a prepaid card. But I'm like, my day-to-day bank card is Visa debit, and his bank, which is a different bank, they do not offer that service. And mine, I've had it for at least over 10 years for sure. And I was just shocked. So it's even
yeah.
interesting that within Canada, one bank, something that's common for well over 10 years, another bank doesn't even offer.
Mm. And it's kind of the same here as well, I think, in Ireland.
Okay. Mhm.
There was a bit of a rustle up. There's actually two I can mention, which is a bit of fun. One bank has went into a receivership and left Ireland completely. So I knew a few people who had accounts with that bank, and it was a very complicated process to, um, deal with that. Uh, there's also a lot of cases here where they've started clamping down on the ability to move money into Ireland and then back out again because of the whole money laundering thing. Uh,
Mhm.
you know, moving drugs, moving illegal products. It's a good way to move that money around. Uh, as a personal anecdote, my experience of getting an account was very easy, but I had picked a bank that had a very, very long but straightforward ability to create an account here before I even arrived. All they needed
Oh,
was my address in Australia and some identity documents, done at ungodly hours because of the time zone differences. But once it was in, which was great.
good.
Actually, for anyone listening, Bank of Ireland is where I got that done, and I recommend it to anyone that asks as well.
Okay.
But there's a very interesting movement over here, and possibly the rest of Europe as well, where there are digital only bank accounts or bank services. Revolut is a huge one over here,
Mhm.
and a lot of people moving here will advise that the rates are better, it's easier to manage your money, all that stuff with Revolut. And they only require identity documents from wherever you are in order to create that account. So
Right.
some banks here have started offering digital only services as well.
Okay.
I think the idea of the online, internet banking thing is still kind of fresh over here a little bit, unfortunately. Um,
Okay.
they still have a lot of branches around to do things in. Uh, and look, my mentality with money here, with us getting started, was that I have enough to financially support myself for a little while. I also have enough that I don't have to worry about exchange rates so much when I make the transfer to make things happen here. So for me, it was straightforward. I transferred my money with IBAN or Swift, or I can't remember which one I used at the time, from my bank in Australia to my bank here. And, you know, it ate a bunch out of the exchange rate and whatever transfer fees were involved. But that was the simplest, no hassle process for me. That removed the burden of me worrying about, penny pinching for 20 euro here or 30 euro there, because that
Mhm.
wasn't my primary thing that I was worried about. But there is a lot of currency transfer services that people recommend here to make the most out of whatever you transfer. If you're just doing like a few thousand here, then you probably wouldn't worry about it. But some people are looking to get mortgages and buy houses. And
Right.
if you've sold your home in your home country and you want to transfer, 150,000 Australian, you'll want to optimize that tax rate as much as possible and optimize the currency exchange as well, just so that you're getting the most
Absolutely.
out of it.
Mhm.
So yeah.
And I have some of that. So I have the Revolut. In Spain, I've got N26, which is the same. It's kind of like an online banking. I use Wise. as well, which is
Mhm.
great for transfer and to hold money into it, different currencies. And so there are a number of ones as well that are great. But yeah, and it is something to definitely think about. And I always say to people, it's really important to have multiple bank accounts, especially when you're traveling. If something happens to one, or your card doesn't work, maybe something's wrong with their machine. I've had it happen before where when I first, it was before I had my visa. I think maybe it was it before. No, it was still my Visa debit. But anyway, when I first moved to Barcelona, my Visa debit would not work with certain bank providers. So even if I was
Mm.
went to pay for food, if it was a certain bank, it wouldn't accept my card. It wouldn't decline it. It would just be like, we can't read this card.
Yeah.
And that became a bit of a problem because when I first, it was the only one that I had. And I'm like, there's
Mm.
money in there. It's your machine. They're like, it's your card. I'm like, no, it's your machine does not work with my card. My card does not work with your machine. Like they both work, but they're not working together.
Yeah.
And so having that second bank, I can't remember which one, if it was Revolut or the N26 that I got after, just then made things easier because if I was using it with my Canadian bank card, certain machines, no problem, it would work. Certain banks, no problem, it would work, but other ones it wouldn't. So then I could use the other card and still go to a restaurant, knowing it doesn't matter what machine they have, I'm still able to pay for my lunch because I now have funds in both. So I mean, that's just one example. There's other examples that we think of: bank collapsing, identity theft, what happened in Canada a while ago was freezing bank accounts for protesting and things like
Oh
that. Like,
yeah.
yeah. So when that started, I was like,
Mm.
I don't trust the government at all. I had already had a couple accounts since then, but since then, I've really talked to people. It's like, you need to open up another bank account. So, if the government threatens you, or if it is identity theft or anything, that you at least have some money in another account to buy some food, pay your bills, pay your mortgage, hire a lawyer if you need to, depending upon what the situation is. And it really is important. And there's so many options nowadays where
Yeah.
um, you don't always have to travel to a country. It is a little bit harder and there's more hoops to jump through, but there are some countries that you can still open up a bank, or there's some of the online ones that you can use, and just to transfer some funds in there every month or whatever it may be, just to have some extra cash in there just in case. And hopefully you never need it. And then you know what? Then you've got extra money to, I don't know, go on vacation or use in your retirement or
Yeah.
whatever it may be, because it's building up. And if you're always kind of putting money in there, it's a savings of a just in case. And if you never need it, then it's a woohoo. I'm gonna go do what I want.
Yeah, that's it. And I've often thought about as our far-flung future, because I don't think we're in the stage of the world at the moment where settling down in one place for 60 years is the thing that people do. Um,
Mm,
and also exploring tax and residency and visas and all that kind of stuff. Uh, I would like the idea that if finances weren't a burden, that my wife and I could live in many different places throughout the year and do our various individual entrepreneurial things in
mm.
whatever capacity we choose to do them. And yeah, having that kind of financial management, doing a thing like that would be super important, because you don't want to have all of your money living in one country and then having to deal with tax rates, or you're a citizen or someone on a visa that's since left and the government can control where those funds sit, or have to freeze them because they need to check that you're not deceased or absconded somewhere. I was about to go into an example about where you might go to a place where you can't return, but we're talking about planet Earth, so it would have to be the moon. I think one day that'll be possible, but
One day
yeah.
it could be possible. And yeah, you just never know. And so it's a saying I've heard as a kid, and I never thought of it in the different ways I think of it now, is don't keep all your eggs in one basket. And,
Mm.
as a kid, or even as a young adult, at first I thought of it towards the stock market. Like, don't put all of your money in one stock, or don't put it just in the stock market. And now I realize there's so many things. Like, don't just have everything you own in one country. Don't have all your money in one bank in one country. Just don't have everything in one place. It's and that's the whole point kind of behind Global Citizen, is to be like around the globe, diversify, have opportunities, and um, just opportunities to do different things, be different places. And you never know. And exchange rates change all the time too. So if you've got
Mm,
a bank account or something in another country, and I don't watch exchange rates that closely, but I check them out sometimes. And for some people, though, when they know that they need euro, like I use euro and US dollar and Canadian dollar, but if I know that I'm going to be going to the US or back to Canada, I sometimes kind of watch those rates a little bit to see, okay, when should I transfer money from one account to another? Because if it's small, it's not going to make that much of a difference. But if it's a larger amount, it can make a significant difference for sure. And over time,
mm,
if you're always buying when it drops a little bit and you're putting it in, you're getting it at a best rate, and then you're spending it, whatever it may be, 1, 2, 3 years later, depending upon um, what your plan is. So,
yeah.
so Matthew, you said that you do have your own podcast. I think it would be a very interesting one for our listeners. So tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Well, we actually started it a few months before we left Australia because it's called From My Home to Yours.
Okay.
It's us discussing our expat repat journey from Australia to Ireland because we're moving from my home to her home. So, people fill in the blanks with whichever homes they're going to or coming from. But yeah, we share, we just discuss on the podcast different things about the move, our feelings and emotions, the different experiences that we undertake as part of that move, generally to share advice to others, because there isn't a huge amount of specific, detailed information for the space of people, such as couples without kids, who don't intend to have kids, moving to Ireland, which is a very family first place. And
Mhm.
from Australia, at least, you'll find that most people moving to Ireland from there have kids, or they are both Irish and have kids and intend to move back, which is a very weird thing. It's sometimes you see it, but it's quite rare to see a couple of Aussies going, "Oh yeah, we'll give that a crack, see what happens." Um, excluding your backpackers and people that want to explore a little bit more of the world. So really, we wanted to target that niche a little bit, and we've had 16 episodes so far. We've been on a break for the last month because we've kind of hit a point where we're not experiencing and able to share new things for people to think about, because we've done all those things now. We're at the time where we're settled in, we're just living life now. We're in like after phase one. There's nothing left to do to make the move happen. So we're kind of rethinking, retooling a little bit for how we want to approach the podcast and see what we do. But I've had the opportunity to talk to a few people over here as well. We've talked to Stephanie Wickham with expattaxes.ie, and they've got a podcast as well, which is great. I think I'm going to be on that on Friday. We talked to an insurance company over here, which is very interesting for purchasing cars in Ireland. You need to make sure that you have registration, the NCT, which is basically the roadworthy check, and the insurance all in place before you drive the car off the lot. And that's
Oh,
if you
wow.
can get a car and you have enough money to get it. Just like houses, the secondhand car market is incredibly scarce over here for probably the same reason that houses are as well. And we also talked to that government body I mentioned earlier in this episode, Crosscare Irish Diaspora Support Project. A couple of people from there. They're the ones pushing all this policy to make it easier for people to get their visas done in Ireland, as well as communicating with embassies all over the world to make it easier for anybody to come here or to go anywhere else from here. So it's a bit of a family blog to keep people that we know up to date with what we're doing, as well as a bit of an advice show. And because I'm a podcaster myself, I've played around with the format a little bit. There is one episode that I'm particularly proud of where we made voice recordings of every step of the journey from when we emptied and left our property, which we still own. We're renting to other people. So we had to get rid of our possessions, put them in storage, and all the emotions with that, and being with my parents for about a week before we flew out of the country, being on the plane, in the airport, and then landing in Dublin once our journey was complete. Lots of little emotional voice messages assembled into an episode with interstitial captured environmental noises. Like my wife particularly is fond of the sound of magpies in Australia, the call that they make, and it really reminds her of Australia. So we had to throw in a couple of them too.
Well, that was nice. Well, that's great. And it just even it just gives people also things to think about and things to go, oh, this is normal to feel this way. Oh, that's great. So I think it's a great podcast, and we'll make sure to put a link to that in the show notes below. I think it'll be great for our listeners. So Matthew, I just wanted to say thank you very much for your time today. I know the listeners got a lot of valuable information, and I hope they check out your podcast as well.
Thank you, Sally. It's been great to be here and talk about all these things I've been learning that, I can use somewhere else other than from my own context. So it's been great.
Great. Thank you.